few months ago, I wrote a reflection on resentment. And I don't remember now what caused that kind of sensation in me to want to write about resentment, or how exactly the different things around it formed together for me to get to the idea that I ended up with. But I remember that when I finished writing it, and a few more months when I went back to revise the work a little and to read it again, there seemed to be a feeling of completion, as though I was completely over this sensation of resentment, this experience of resentment. And funnily enough, I found myself today in this feeling of a kind of heaviness inside in one center. And yet it's a feeling with which one does not want to dwell. At the same time, it's not something that seems to also want to be ignored. And so there's this tension between looking towards this void so as to let it be and to let it dissipate, and also just letting it go and going about the other things in the day to day. And so I found myself wanting to do the usual, to make art, to write, to reflect, to read. But somehow none of the things so far that I've looked through really hit that kind of urge that's been there. Nothing seems to scratch the itch. Until I saw this article again, and I thought, why not reflect on it a little more? Or at the very least, read it. And so this short piece titled simply Resentment, I think I wrote it a few months back. And it starts with this idea that resentment, like many strong and catalytic emotions, feels unnecessarily negative and complex sometimes. And from here, I guess we'll do a bit of analysis with this as well. We see that there are three main ideas actually that I wanted to point towards when I introduced this idea of resentment. That for me, this concept is catalytic. It incites, or is the very cause, and is a needed ingredient for change. And it's also unnecessarily negative. That idea, it's not simply negative, but it's unnecessarily so. And third is that it's complex. I'm not sure why I added strong there. Or perhaps I did because it is a strong emotion. It's an overwhelming thing. And so the description of it as strong is something that is kind of at the preface of the whole experience altogether, that there's this strong feeling. What is it? Okay, it's something catalytic. It's unnecessarily negative and it's complex. Resentment. That's our idea of resentment. One may wish to be completely without it, or so live with a particular kind of guilt. The feeling of resentment is deeply rooted in one's center, similar to a heartache, but much more subtle and numbing. It is despise mixed seamlessly with affection. Think of a Chinese finger trap. That The more one tries to unlock it by pulling outward, the tighter it would wrap around one's fingers. Resentment has a similar mechanism. There is a desire to move outward and connect with the other, yet doing so drags one back into its all consuming depths. This may seem like a character flaw, lacking the sufficient willingness to forgive, to love, to be the bigger person, or the ability to forget. However, again, as many seemingly strong and catalytic emotions, resentment may be simpler than it appears. At the root of such an experience is a desire or a need. And the bridge to resentment is the belief that one is incapable of fulfilling such a desire or need. The resentment could then be directed towards another, which one believes to be the main reason why fulfillment is impossible. Perhaps one may have tried all the means that they have within themselves, but to no avail. Hence, they turn to some other person or being, that loved one, an institution, God, whatever, and find them just as incapable or unwilling to do something about the problem. It might even be the case that the resentment simply goes back to the person themselves. Such is possible, for having found no solution, the problem persists. That is, despite having plenty of ideas that one may simply get rid of the problem if one tries hard enough, we are taught to reconcile, to forgive, to love, to transcend one's human tendencies for the sake of connection. But this is at times at risk of completely disregarding those human tendencies. There seems to be a keenness to make gods out of the human experience. Such a compulsion can be noble, no doubt, but I think there is something essentially desirable in keeping what is human, and accepting desires and needs as something that inherently needs fulfillment. They can only be complete in themselves when they are addressed and not disregarded. While there is definitely more to existence than just these fickle human things, the ephemeral is a constituent of the eternal, the superficial of the transcendental. To think of one as the other is blasphemous. When one starts to think of something mortal as divine, is that not an act of idolatry? Is it not the case that to see something as capable of transcendence, of having meaning and potency that can overcome the inherent good, hence it should be overcome for the sake of this good, a way of divinizing. I'm not sure if divinizing is the correct word. I believe there's a more accurate term for that. But this has been the idea that I've been thinking about for a while now. This insight that there's this tendency to not accept something because it's not the end all be all of the end all be all. And by that I mean, I think if we look at a lot of the ills of society, of individuals, the struggles with the self, with the others, much of it is taking something that is human, that is inherently not perfect, in the sense of perfect as in this concept of perfect, of divine, of God, and wanting it to be that. For example, we take something as lifestyles, careers, vocations, and always put it against a kind of evaluation of whether it's successful or not, and only accept something if it's a success, that it has to work. And if it's something that's not perfect, it's not excellent, then it should be made into something excellent. It should be turned into something else. And a lot of perspectives, a lot of ideologies would view such an attitude towards these things as a kind of virtue, of a way of implementing particular values, that we seek for excellence, we seek for success, because that's a good. However, if we think about it on one level, having to conform to such ideas would necessitate a belief in something that does not have to be true. And so one would be in the midst of choosing between agreeing with this thing or disagreeing with this thing. And both can have the possibility of correctness, of accuracy. And on the other hand, if we try to look at it in a more internal aspect of those ideologies and perspectives, let's say a lot of them all are rooted in particular idea of God or of the good, that this is the correct way and the other way is not. In that sense, I think there's still something kind of strange and lacking in thinking that God, the divine, the good, needs those that are not them to be more like them in order for them to persist. And if something that's supposedly so powerful that it's revered would need something less powerful to be powerful, then doesn't that put their power into question altogether? I continue. That is not to completely disregard the inherent divinity dwelling in all things created by the divine. But if all of one's organs acts like the mind, then there would be no heart pumping blood, nor skin to feel varied textures. By this, I mean, if one seeks to escape the individual by disregarding it for the sake of the greater good, the one, or heaven, then what is the point of those higher order endeavors? I took a course on Buddhism early this year, and there I learned of this concept of the not self, which on another tangent is more commonly translated as a no self. But perhaps in another note, where I think I wrote about it in a similar post, looking at it as a not self is more philosophically consistent. So there's this concept of the no self. Initially, I imagined this no self to be a kind of transcendence from the self or ego that is necessary to reach a state of heavenly liberation. That it is another conceptualization of letting go of these human tendencies that is hindering the good from its supposed omnipotence. That by not having a self, we are able to be of this good fully. However, reflecting on the Dhammapada chapter on oneself, the immediate verse says, if one knew oneself to be precious, one would guard oneself with care. The sage will watch over herself in any part of the night. The chapter ends with a similar reminder. Don't give up on your own welfare for the sake of others' welfare, however great. Clearly know your own welfare and be intent on the highest good. I think this shows a clear image of the mechanism of transcendence of the human side. The highest good involves a self, specifically caring and considering it as precious. Putting this together with the idea of the not self, apparently I also wrote it here, that negates the concept of a permanent, everlasting, absolute entity. The consolidation is as such. Take care of the fickle human self, clinging not to the illusion that it would be possible to be a perfect, spotless version of you, and instead consider always the welfare of this impermanent, ephemeral, limited entity. The divine, if we are to try to describe this concept in simple terms, is this permanent, everlasting, absolute entity. If God be truly God, God would not need a human attempt at protecting or perpetuating godly powers, which is to say that God remains God despite all the anger and resentment and hurt in the world. One can dwell so deeply in their negative emotions, and an absolute entity remains untouched. More so, the divine remains to be permeating all such experiences. The absolute is everything, in both the things humans consider good and bad. These things seem strong and catalytic only to us anyway. I forgot to look up how to solve a Chinese finger trap, but if there is a way of solving it at all, that is, I think that maybe one possibility is to simply play with it for a while and then take it off once one has had enough. Similarly, there is a plethora of ways of solving resentment, but I find that sometimes I just need to feel it for a while until it loses its charm, till I realize that love persists, but the stronghold of resentment, like many other human sensation, fades away, then comes back, and then fades again, like waves on the ocean, the lovely ocean of the divine that allows for these waves to be, is that which is everlasting. It also calls human to surf along and watch its glimmer. Thanks for listening.